My name is Clara, and I'm 32 years old. For the last 10 years, my world has been a quiet one, filled with the scent of linseed oil, turpentine, and aging canvas. As an art restorer, I spend my days bringing forgotten beauty back to life. But 6 months ago, my own life was shattered, and I found myself at the center of a drama so cruel, so unbelievable, that nobody believed me. My own parents, the two people who were supposed to protect me, stood in a courtroom and accused me of robbing them. They painted me as a thief who had stolen my grandfather's entire $18 million estate. The family, the press, even my own lawyer began to doubt me. But they didn't know the truth. They didn't know my grandfather was the most brilliant, eccentric man I'd ever met, and that his greatest masterpiece wasn't a painting, but a final, devastating lesson in justice that he left behind on a USB drive. If you've ever felt underestimated or unheard by your own family, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Before I reveal the secret that turned that courtroom upside down, hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories about how truth, when it finally comes to light, can be more powerful than any lie. Before the chaos, my life was defined by a quiet, predictable rhythm. I lived in a small third-floor walk-up apartment in the city, a cozy space filled with more books than furniture, and always smelling faintly of oil paints. My studio, a rented loft a few blocks away, was my sanctuary. It was where I felt most myself, surrounded by the silent, patient faces of portraits from centuries past. I wasn't wealthy, but I was content. My work was my passion, a meticulous, patient craft that suited my temperament. This quiet life, however, was built upon a foundation of family dynamics that had been set in stone since my childhood. I have a younger brother, Leo. To my parents, David and Eleanor, Leo was the sun, and I was a distant, dimly lit planet orbiting him. He was the investment. I was the obligation. Leo was sharp, ambitious, and followed the path they had laid out for him. Business school, a series of tech startups funded by their savings, and a life that looked impressive on paper. He was the son who would carry on the family's imagined legacy of financial success. I, on the other hand, was the quiet, artistic daughter. When I chose to study art history and conservation in college instead of economics, my father called it a tragic waste of a good mind. My mother sighed dramatically, lamenting that I was choosing a hobby over a career. While they paid for Leo's prestigious MBA without a second thought, my own education was funded by scholarships and part-time jobs, with my parents contributing the bare minimum, always with the reminder that I was on a frivolous path. This dynamic became painfully clear after I graduated. Leo's first startup, a flashy app that burned through cash with alarming speed, inevitably failed. To bail him out of the massive debt he'd accrued, my parents sold a collection of antique silver that had been in my mother's family for generations. They called it supporting a visionary through a tough patch. A year later, when I needed a modest loan of $5,000 to purchase a specialized piece of equipment for my restoration studio, a tool that would allow me to take on more significant commissions, I was met with a stern lecture. "Clara, you need to learn to be financially responsible," my father said, his voice laced with disappointment. "Perhaps if you had a real job, you wouldn't need handouts." The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. I, who had budgeted every penny since I was 18, was being lectured by a man who had just thrown 100 times that amount at my brother's failed vanity project. But the true fault line in our family wasn't about me or Leo. It was about my maternal grandfather, Arthur Pembroke. Arthur was a force of nature, an eccentric, wickedly intelligent man who had built a formidable real estate empire from the ground up. He wasn't a warm and fuzzy grandfather. He was sharp, observant, and had little patience for fools, which, in his opinion, included most people. As he grew older and his health declined, someone needed to care for him. My parents, despite living only 40 minutes away, treated visits to Arthur as a chore. They'd pop in for an hour on major holidays, their conversations always circling back to his portfolio, his assets, his legacy. They saw him not as a father, but as a vault they were waiting to inherit. I saw him differently. I moved into the small guest cottage on his sprawling, beautiful property 8 years ago, initially just to help manage his appointments and medications. But over time, it became much more. I became his companion. We'd spend evenings in his library, a magnificent 2-story room filled with first editions, and he would tell me stories about his life. He taught me how to play chess, how to appreciate a good scotch, and, most importantly, he taught me to see the world not just for what it is, but for what it could be. He was the only one who ever truly supported my passion. He'd visit my studio, peering at my work through his thick glasses, and say things like, "You're not just fixing things, Clara. You're preserving stories. It's important work." To my parents, my role was simple. I was the unpaid, live-in caregiver. My devotion was their convenience. They were free to focus on Leo's brilliant career, while I handled the unpleasantness of an aging parent. They saw my choice as a lack of ambition, a quiet admission that I couldn't make it in the real world. They had no idea that the years I spent with Arthur were the most enriching and educational of my life. They saw me as the reliable, quiet daughter who would never make waves, a permanent fixture in the background of their lives. They had no idea the storm that was coming, or that the man they so deeply underestimated was arming me to survive it. The storm arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning in April. I found my grandfather, Arthur, in his favorite armchair by the library window, a half-finished cup of tea on the table beside him and a book open on his lap. He had passed away peacefully in his sleep. The grief was a physical blow, a sudden, crushing weight that stole the air from my lungs. For 8 years, he had been my anchor, my mentor, my greatest champion. The silence in that grand old house was deafening, a hollow echo where his sharp wit and rumbling laughter used to be. I called my mother first. Her initial reaction was a sharp intake of breath, followed by a flurry of practical questions. "When did it happen? Have you called the doctor? We need to notify the lawyer immediately." There was a chilling efficiency to her grief, a focus on logistics that felt jarringly premature. My parents and Leo arrived within the hour. My mother, Eleanor, swept into the house, her eyes scanning the valuable paintings and antique furniture as if taking inventory. My father, David, placed a stiff, awkward hand on my shoulder, muttering, "He had a good, long life." Leo, ever the self-important businessman, was already on his phone in the foyer, speaking in hushed, irritated tones about a meeting he now had to reschedule. Their sorrow felt performative, a thin veneer over a palpable sense of anticipation. They were already moving past the man and onto his assets. The days leading up to the funeral were a blur of a different kind of pain. My parents took charge, not to lift the burden from my shoulders, but to seize control of the narrative. They selected the most expensive casket, ordered ostentatious floral arrangements, and spoke to relatives about honoring Arthur's incredible legacy, a phrase that had become their thinly veiled code for his fortune. The day of the will reading was a week after the funeral. We all gathered in the stately, wood-paneled office of Mr. Harrison, Arthur's longtime friend and attorney. The air was thick with tension. My parents and Leo sat on one side of the massive mahogany desk, a united front of expectant heirs. I sat on the other, feeling small and alone, my grief still a raw, open wound. Mr. Harrison, a kind, solemn man in his 70s, cleared his throat and began to read. The legal language was dense, but the figures were staggering. He detailed Arthur's real estate holdings, his extensive stock portfolio, his world-class art collection. The final valuation was just over $18 million. I saw my parents exchange a subtle, triumphant glance. This was the moment they had been waiting for their entire lives. Then, Mr. Harrison paused, adjusting his spectacles as he read the final, crucial paragraph. Regarding the aforementioned assets, he read slowly, his brow furrowed in confusion. All liquid accounts have been closed, and all physical assets, including real estate and art, have been liquidated and transferred from my estate. The resulting funds have been secured. He looked up from the document, his gaze sweeping over our bewildered faces. "I'm afraid I don't understand," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "The accounts, they're empty." The silence that followed was absolute. Then, it shattered. "What do you mean, empty?" my father demanded, his voice booming in the quiet office. "That's impossible. Where did it go?" My mother's face, moments before alight with avarice, was now a mask of fury. Her eyes, cold and sharp, swiveled to fixate on me. "She did it!" she hissed, her voice low and venomous. She was the only one with him day in and day out. She had power of attorney. She must have manipulated him, forced him to sign everything over to her. Leo chimed in, his voice dripping with condescension. "It's obvious, isn't it? The quiet, dutiful granddaughter playing the long game. She's been slowly draining his accounts for years." I was speechless, frozen in my chair. The accusation was so monstrous, so far from any conceivable reality, that my mind couldn't process it. I looked at Mr. Harrison, hoping for an ally, but even he looked at me with a flicker of doubt in his kind eyes. My parents' story, as vile as it was, made a twisted kind of sense if you didn't know the truth. They stood up in unison, a towering wave of righteous indignation. "We will not stand for this," my father declared, pointing a shaking finger at me. "We will see you in court, Clara. We will get back every single penny you stole from this family." My parents' accusations were absurd, but I was too lost in grief to fight back, too stunned by the sheer venom of their betrayal. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of their crusade to not only take my inheritance, but to completely destroy me. In the weeks that followed the will reading, my parents launched a campaign against me that was as systematic as it was cruel. My grief for my grandfather became a secondary pain, overshadowed by the constant, exhausting stress of defending myself against my own family. Their first move was a smear campaign. They began methodically calling every relative, every family friend, planting the seeds of their poisonous narrative. The story they spun was a masterpiece of manipulation. I was the conniving caregiver who had preyed on a vulnerable old man, isolating him from his real family while secretly liquidating his fortune. Suddenly, phone calls from aunts and uncles, once warm and sympathetic, turned cold and interrogative. "Clara, dear," my Aunt Carol said, her voice dripping with false concern. "Your mother told me you've been under a lot of stress. Is there something you need to tell us about Arthur's finances?" The implication was clear. I was no longer a grieving granddaughter. I was a suspect. Their second act of aggression was a physical invasion. I was still staying in the guest cottage at Arthur's estate, trying to begin the monumental task of sorting through a lifetime of his belongings. One Saturday morning, I was startled by the sound of a large truck rumbling up the driveway. My parents emerged, followed by a man with a clipboard who introduced himself as a professional appraiser. "We're just getting a baseline valuation of the contents of the house, Clara," my mother announced, breezing past me as if she owned the place. "For legal purposes, you understand." For the next 4 hours, I was forced to follow them from room to room as they pointed at Arthur's treasures, his beloved paintings, his first edition books, the grandfather clock in the hall while the appraiser attached monetary values to my memories. They treated me like a squatter, an obstacle in their path to claiming what they believed was theirs. At one point, my father picked up a small, framed photo of Arthur and me from the mantelpiece. "You really had him fooled, didn't you?" he muttered, before placing it face down. I tried to reason with them. I arranged to meet them at a neutral location, a quiet coffee shop halfway between our homes. I came prepared with bank statements showing my modest income, my own financial records, anything to prove that I wasn't secretly hoarding millions. "Why are you doing this?" I pleaded, my voice shaking. "You know I would never do what you're accusing me of. Arthur wouldn't have wanted this fighting." My father leaned back, a smug, dismissive look on his face. "Arthur isn't here anymore, is he? And we know you have the money, Clara. Just tell us where at Island. Admit what you did, and maybe, just maybe, we'll consider being lenient." My mother twisted my words into a confession. "Her hands are shaking," she whispered to my father, loud enough for me to hear. "She's obviously guilty." The meeting was a disaster, leaving me feeling more hopeless than ever. They didn't want truth. They wanted a scapegoat and a payday. The onslaught continued. A few days later, I was formally served with legal papers. They were suing me, not just for the $18 million, but for punitive damages, for infliction of emotional distress. I sat on the floor of my tiny apartment and read the lawsuit, a 40-page document filled with the most vicious, calculated lies I had ever seen. They claimed I had a history of manipulative behavior, that I had systematically alienated Arthur from them, that my quiet lifestyle was a clever front for a master criminal. They used my passion for art against me, suggesting my knowledge of the art world made me uniquely qualified to sell off his collection on the black market. Every line felt like a physical blow. The public humiliation was next. They knew I had a major client meeting at my studio, a curator from a prominent museum. As if on cue, my parents appeared at my studio door just as the meeting was concluding. They didn't knock. They burst in, my mother sobbing theatrically, my father red-faced with rage. "There she is!" he boomed, pointing at me. "The daughter who robbed her own family and left her parents with nothing." My client, a distinguished older woman, stared in horror. I tried to usher my parents out, but they created a scene, yelling accusations in the hallway for everyone in the building to hear. The client left with a brief, pitying apology. The damage was done. My professional reputation, something I had worked so hard to build, was now tainted by their manufactured drama. It was Mr. Harrison who finally gave me the perspective I desperately needed. I went to his office, defeated, the lawsuit in my hand. I told him everything: the smear campaign, the appraiser, the disastrous coffee meeting, the scene at my studio. I confessed that I was starting to break, that maybe it would be easier to just give up. He listened patiently, his steepled fingers resting on his chin. When I was finished, he looked at me with a sad, knowing expression. "Clara," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "I've known your parents for over 30 years. I watched them grow up. This isn't just about money. It's about a narrative they've built their entire lives. In their story, Leo is the star, and you are a supporting character. Your quiet competence, your deep bond with Arthur, it threatened that story. It proved them wrong about you, and they can't stand that." He leaned forward. "This is not a fight you can win with reason or appeals to their love, because their actions aren't born of love. They are born of ego and greed. You need to stop trying to make them understand and start preparing to defend yourself. You must fight back, Clara. Not for the money, but for your name, for your integrity, and for Arthur's memory." Mr. Harrison's words hit me like a ton of bricks. He was right. All this time I had been operating under the assumption that this was a terrible misunderstanding, that if I could just find the right words, they would see the truth. But he had unmasked their motivation for me. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a war they had declared on me, and I was completely unarmed, or so my parents thought. Just when I thought my parents' cruelty had reached its peak, they found a way to sink even lower. Their lawsuit was moving forward, but it was a slow, expensive process. They needed a faster way to gain leverage, a way to break me completely. Their solution was an act of such profound, invasive malice that it redefined the very meaning of betrayal. They filed a motion with the court to have me declared mentally incompetent. It was a calculated legal maneuver, designed not only to undermine my credibility in the civil suit, but also to seize control over every aspect of my life. If they succeeded, they would be appointed my legal guardians, empowered to manage my affairs, which was, of course, a euphemism for gaining control of any assets they still believed I was hiding. The legal documents arrived via courier on a rainy Monday afternoon. I sat on my sofa, the damp chill of the day seeping into the room, and read the sworn affidavits from my own parents, David and Eleanor Pembroke, and my brother, Leo. The words blurred through my tears. They twisted my grief for Arthur into evidence of profound depression and detachment from reality. My career as an art restorer, a job requiring immense focus and skill, was described as an unconventional and isolating obsession, indicative of an inability to function in normal society. They recounted conversations out of context, painting my quiet, introverted nature as a sign of social anxiety and paranoid delusions. They even used the fact that I had spent 8 years caring for my grandfather as proof that I was incapable of independent living and had developed a pathological dependency. Every word was a carefully crafted lie, a dagger designed to strip me of my agency, my identity, and my sanity in the eyes of the law. The final, crushing blow was a supporting statement from a psychiatrist I had never met. He claimed that, based on the evidence provided by my family, he had reason to believe I was a danger to myself and incapable of managing my own legal and financial decisions. They were trying to have me legally erased. They weren't just trying to take my inheritance. They were trying to take my very self. That was the moment. As I sat there, the flimsy legal papers shaking in my hand, something inside me shifted. The deep, aching sadness that had been my constant companion for months began to recede, replaced by a wave of something else, entirely a cold, clear, and unyielding anger. The fog of grief and confusion finally lifted, and I saw my parents for exactly who they were, monsters hiding in plain sight, willing to burn their own daughter to the ground to get what they wanted. I was no longer a victim to be pitied. I was a target who had just been handed a reason to fight back with every ounce of strength I possessed. My mind, suddenly sharp and focused, flashed back to a conversation I'd had with Arthur a few months before he died. We were in his library, and he was telling me about a particularly clever forgery he had once identified. "The best art isn't just beautiful, Clara," he had said, his eyes twinkling. "It's clever. It has a secret to tell. You just have to know how to listen." His words echoed in my mind, over and over. A secret to tell. Suddenly, my breath caught in my throat. I remembered the last gift he had ever given me for my birthday, just a week before he passed. It was a strange, modern painting, a chaotic swirl of colors and shapes, so unlike his usual taste for classical landscapes. At the time, I had thought it was just one of his eccentric whims. I had thanked him, and then stored it carefully in my studio, wrapped in cloth. Now, his words gave that strange gift a new, urgent meaning. It wasn't a whim. It was a message. My grandfather's words echoed in my mind. A secret to tell. And in that moment of chilling clarity, I realized my fight for survival had just been handed its first crucial clue. The next morning, I was at my studio before sunrise. I bypassed the half-restored Baroque portrait on my easel and went straight to the back storage room. There it was, leaning against the wall, still wrapped in its protective cloth, Arthur's last gift. I carefully unwrapped it and placed it under the bright, unforgiving light of my examination lamp. It was an abstract piece, a cacophony of texture and color that, to the untrained eye, looked like meaningless chaos. But I wasn't an untrained eye. I was a conservator. I had spent years learning to see what lay beneath the surface. I started with a magnifying glass, scanning every inch of the canvas. Nothing. I moved on to ultraviolet light, searching for hidden signatures or underdrawings. Still nothing. Frustration began to creep in. Was I just projecting my desperation onto a simple, strange painting? Then I remembered another one of Arthur's lessons. Look for the anomaly, Clara. The one thing that doesn't belong. I ran my fingers lightly over the surface. The paint was thick, impasto, with deep ridges and valleys, except for one small, perfectly smooth patch in the bottom right corner. It was no bigger than a postage stamp, and its texture was completely inconsistent with the rest of the piece. My heart began to pound. With the delicate touch of a surgeon, I took a small cotton swab and a tiny amount of a specialized solvent, a mixture I used to remove modern varnish from older oil paintings. I dabbed it gently onto the smooth patch. The top layer of acrylic paint began to dissolve, revealing not the white of the gessoed canvas underneath, but a different color, a deep, aged-looking brown. Slowly, carefully, I worked for over an hour, cleaning away the abstract chaos. Underneath, a message began to appear, written in my grandfather's familiar, elegant script. It wasn't a letter, it was a riddle. Where stories sleep but never die, and a Florentine mourns beneath a painted sky, seek the key to my final reply. I knew immediately what he meant. Where stories sleep but never die, his library. A Florentine mourns beneath a painted sky. He was referring to a specific, priceless book he owned. A first edition of Dante's Inferno, illustrated by Gustave Doré. One of the most famous illustrations was of Dante looking down upon the suffering souls. The book was kept on the highest shelf of the library, a place so high you needed a rolling ladder to reach it. I called Mr. Harrison. "I think I found something," I said, my voice breathless with a mixture of excitement and fear. "I need to get back into my grandfather's library." With his legal authority, he arranged for me to have unrestricted access to the house. That afternoon, we stood together in the silent, magnificent library. I climbed the ladder, my hand closing around the cool, leather-bound spine of the Inferno. I pulled it from the shelf. It was heavier than it should have been. I opened it, and my breath caught. The first 100 pages had been hollowed out, and nestled inside the cavity was a small, ornate, old-fashioned brass key. There was no note, just the key. "A safe deposit box," Mr. Harrison breathed, his eyes wide. We spent the rest of the day calling banks in the city. On the 5th try, we found it. A box opened by Arthur Pembroke 30 years ago, with a special provision that access could only be granted with this specific unlisted key. The next morning, we were at the bank. The manager led us into the vault, a world of polished steel and hushed reverence. He unlocked the drawer, and I slid out a long, heavy metal box. Inside the private viewing room, I placed the brass key into the lock. It turned with a satisfying click. I lifted the lid. The contents were simple, yet they held the power to change everything. On top was a thick, leather-bound journal. Beneath it was a single black USB drive, with a small typewritten label that read, "For the Courtroom." I opened the journal. The first page was a letter addressed to me. "My dearest Clara," it began. "If you are reading this, then the vultures have descended as I always knew they would. Forgive my theatrics, but I couldn't bear the thought of your parents and brother squandering my life's work on vanity and foolishness. I have watched them for years, Clara. I have seen their greed. I have heard their whispers. This journal contains my documentation of their behavior, every phone call where they asked for money, every visit where they probed about my will. It is your shield. As for the estate, I have converted it, all of it, into the safest, most untraceable assets in the world, bearer bonds. They are hidden, and the rest of this journal contains the clues to find them. It is a treasure hunt, my dear, one that only you, with your patience and keen eye, can solve. The money is yours, to use as you see fit. Live a beautiful life, preserve beautiful things, and do not let them break your spirit. The USB drive is your sword. Use it when the time is right. They will give you no other choice. I held the small, cold USB drive in my hand. It was my grandfather's final masterpiece, his last secret. My parents wanted a courtroom battle. They had lawyers and lies on their side. They had no idea I was about to give them a theatrical performance, directed by a ghost, that they would never, ever forget. The day of the hearing arrived, cloaked in a gray, oppressive drizzle that mirrored the weight in my chest. The courtroom was a cold, impersonal space of dark wood and worn leather, smelling faintly of old paper and anxiety. My parents and Leo sat at the plaintiff's table, a portrait of aggrieved victims. My mother dabbed at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, while my father stared at me with an expression of pure, righteous fury. Their lawyer, a slick, overconfident man named Mr. Davenport, was in his element, his voice echoing through the chamber as he laid out their case. He painted a picture of me as a lonely, unstable spinster who, in a fit of grief-stricken madness and cunning, had systematically stolen a fortune from her doting family. He presented their twisted evidence, the competency evaluation from the psychiatrist I'd never met, the fabricated stories of my isolation, the empty bank accounts. It was a compelling performance, and I could feel the judge's gaze on me, tinged with skepticism. Finally, it was our turn. Mr. Harrison rose, his movements calm and deliberate. He approached the bench, his presence commanding a quiet respect that Mr. Davenport's theatrics lacked. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, "my client, Miss Clara Pembroke, has been the victim of a malicious and deeply fraudulent campaign by her own family. We are here today not only to refute their claims, but to present evidence that will illuminate the true nature of this dispute. Evidence prepared by the very man they claim to be honoring, the late Mr. Arthur Pembroke." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. My parents exchanged a look of confusion, their confidence wavering for the first time. "First," Mr. Harrison continued, "we would like to submit into evidence Mr. Arthur Pembroke's personal journal." He placed the leather-bound journal on the clerk's desk. "In this journal, Mr. Pembroke meticulously documented years of his children's behavior, specifically their relentless and inappropriate inquiries into his finances, and his growing conviction that they were unfit to be his heirs." Mr. Davenport leaped to his feet. "Objection! Hearsay!" The ramblings of a senile old man. "On the contrary," Mr. Harrison countered smoothly, "the journal entries are dated, specific, and corroborated by phone records we can provide. And as for Mr. Pembroke's state of mind, we have a final statement from him that should clarify any doubts." He turned to me and nodded. My heart hammered against my ribs as I handed him the small, black USB drive. "Your Honor," Mr. Harrison announced, holding up the drive, "we have a video message. A final statement from Mr. Arthur Pembroke, recorded 1 month before his death, to be played in the event of a legal challenge to his estate. He anticipated this very day. The judge, his curiosity piqued, granted the request. The courtroom lights dimmed, and the large monitors, previously displaying legal graphics, flickered to life. And then, there he was. My grandfather. He was sitting in his favorite armchair in the library, looking directly into the camera. He looked frail, but his eyes were as sharp and intelligent as ever. The courtroom was utterly silent. "If you are watching this," Arthur began, his voice clear and strong, "it means that my children, David and Eleanor, have done exactly what I predicted they would do. They have allowed their greed to eclipse their grief and their decency." He looked down at a piece of paper in his hands. "For the record, I was of perfectly sound mind when I made the arrangements for my estate. In fact, I have never been of clearer mind." He then looked back at the camera, his gaze so intense it felt as if he were staring directly at my parents. "David, Eleanor, I am profoundly disappointed in you. For decades, I have watched as you have valued money above all else. You saw me not as a father, but as a bank account. You saw your own daughter, Clara, not as a loving, devoted child, but as an obstacle. Ah," he went on, his voice calm and methodical, to detail specific instances I had never even known about a time my father had tried to get him to sign over stocks while he was recovering from pneumonia. A call where my mother suggested he sell his home and move into a facility so they could manage his assets more easily. My mother let out a small, choked sob. My father's face was ashen. Leo looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. "Therefore," Arthur continued, "I have taken steps to protect my legacy from your avarice. I have liquidated my entire estate. The $18 million you are so desperately fighting over is gone from any account you could ever hope to find. I have converted it into a format that rewards intelligence and patience qualities you have, sadly, never demonstrated. I have secured it, and left the means to find it to the only person in this family who ever loved me for who I was, and not for what I had. The only person who deserves it." He paused, his eyes softening as he seemed to look right through the screen at me. "Clara," he ended the video with a final, crushing statement. "Let this video serve as my final will and testament. The inheritance belongs to Clara. It is hers, and hers alone, to find and to use. Any legal action against her is not only baseless, it is a direct violation of my final wishes." The screen went black. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Then the judge, his face a mask of stern disapproval, looked directly at my parents. He slammed his gavel down once. "This case is dismissed, with prejudice," he announced, his voice booming. "The motion for a competency hearing is denied as patently fraudulent, and I would advise you, Mr. and Mrs. Pembroke, to be very grateful that my authority does not extend to charging you with perjury today, though I am sorely tempted." I didn't look at them as Mr. Harrison gathered our papers. I didn't need to see their faces. I could feel their humiliation radiating across the room. I had walked into that courtroom a suspected thief, a fragile woman on the verge of being legally erased. I walked out of that courtroom. I didn't feel triumphant, just free. The battle was over, but the work of rebuilding my life and, as my grandfather intended, the adventure of finding my inheritance had just begun. Leaving the courthouse that day was like stepping out of a long, dark tunnel into blinding sunlight. The weight of my parents' accusations, a burden I had carried for months, simply evaporated. I walked past them in the corridor without a word, without a glance. Their attempts to speak to me, their choked whispers of my name, were nothing but background noise. In my car, I didn't cry. I didn't celebrate. I just sat for a long moment, breathing in the clean, rain-washed air, and felt the profound, bone-deep relief of being believed. That evening, I did something I hadn't been able to do in months. I blocked their numbers. I blocked Leo's number. I severed the toxic lines of communication and, in doing so, took the first real step toward my new life. The next morning, I began the treasure hunt. Arthur's journal was my guide. his familiar handwriting leading me on one last adventure with him. The riddles were intricate, clever, and deeply personal. They required not just my intellect, but my knowledge of him, of our shared history, and of my craft. One clue led me to a specific landscape painting of the Tuscan countryside that hung in the dining room. The riddle hinted at a flaw in the reflection. Using my restorer's tools, I discovered a section of the lake in the painting was not oil paint, but a cleverly disguised panel of painted wood. Behind it was a small, hollowed-out compartment containing the first bundle of bearer bonds, wrapped in oilcloth. Another clue, a cryptic reference to where history is bound by war and peace, led me, of course, to his first edition of Tolstoy's masterpiece. Tucked within its pages, I found not a key, but a complex cipher. It took me 3 days, working late into the night with books on cryptography from his library, to decode it. The message revealed the combination to a hidden safe behind a false wall in his wine cellar. Inside lay the bulk of the fortune. It was a slow, meticulous process that took nearly 3 weeks, but in the end, I had found it all. $18 million in bonds that were as good as cash, now sat in a new, secure vault under my name. The overwhelming feeling wasn't elation, but a profound sense of responsibility. I could hear Arthur's voice in my head, reminding me that money was a tool, not a goal. My first call was not to a realtor or a luxury car dealership, but to a highly recommended financial advisor Mr. Harrison had introduced me to. We created a plan, a conservative and intelligent strategy for managing the wealth, ensuring it would last and grow. My first major purchase was not a mansion, but the small, historic brick building where my art studio was located. With one act, I had secured my passion, my career, and my sanctuary, ensuring no landlord could ever evict me, and no one could ever again threaten my professional life. A sense of peace settled over me, deeper and more satisfying than any luxury could provide. Meanwhile, the shockwaves from the courtroom videos spread like wildfire. The story was too juicy, too dramatic to remain private. A local legal affairs blogger got a hold of the court transcript, and soon the tale of the greedy children and the clever grandfather was circulating through their affluent social and business circles. The consequences for my family were swift and severe. My father, who sat on the boards of several local charities, was quietly asked to resign. My mother, a prominent figure in her garden club and social leagues, was suddenly uninvited to events. They became pariahs, their public image shattered by Arthur's final, undeniable testimony. Leo suffered the most immediate financial blow. The investors in his latest tech venture, spooked by the public scandal and the clear evidence of his character, pulled their funding. His company collapsed. They were forced to sell their sprawling, ostentatious house to cover their mounting legal bills and Leo's debts. They moved into a small, generic rental townhouse, a pale shadow of their former life. They tried to reach me, of course. First came the angry, desperate voicemails left with Mr. Harrison's secretary. Then came the letters, long, rambling screeds of self-pity and blame, which eventually softened into hollow, conditional apologies. "We are so sorry for the misunderstanding, Clara, but you must understand our position." They were never sorry for what they did, only that they had been caught and had lost. I had the money, the freedom, and the peace I craved. But I knew Arthur's final lesson wasn't just about wealth. It was about legacy. It was about what you build, not what you inherit. And I had to decide what mine would be. 1 year can change everything. A year to the day after I walked out of that courtroom, I stood on the small wrought iron balcony of my studio, a mug of hot coffee warming my hands against the crisp autumn air, and watched the city wake up. It was a view I had seen 1,000 times, but now it was different. It was mine. The quiet hum of the street below, the golden light catching the tops of the historic brick buildings, The very air I was breathing, it all felt imbued with a sense of peace I had never known before. The building that housed my studio, my sanctuary, now belonged to me, purchased outright with the first major withdrawal from Arthur's estate. I had renamed it the Pembroke Conservation Studio, his name etched in elegant gold leaf on the front window, a permanent tribute to the man who had championed my quiet passion. The work itself had transformed. Owning the building allowed me to invest in equipment I had once only dreamed of: a digital X-ray machine for examining underpaintings, a state-of-the-art ventilation system, a custom-built climate-controlled vault for storing delicate pieces. My reputation, far from being destroyed by my parents' public attack, had been magnified by the bizarre David and Goliath nature of the story that had circulated. I was no longer just a skilled conservator. I was the restorer who had outwitted her greedy family with a posthumous plan from her brilliant grandfather. The novelty of the story brought in a wave of new, high-profile clients, museums, and private collectors who were not only drawn to my skills, but to the integrity the story represented. But the most meaningful change within these walls was the sound of new voices. I had hired 2 apprentices, Maria and Ben, both brilliant students from the local art college who were bursting with talent but weighed down by student loans. Maria was meticulous and patient, with a touch so delicate she could remove a century of grime from a canvas without disturbing a single brushstroke. Ben was a bold innovator, fascinated by the chemistry of pigments and constantly experimenting with new, non-invasive conservation techniques. I saw so much of myself in their passion, and mentoring them, giving them the support and encouragement that Arthur had given me, became the cornerstone of my new life. We weren't just colleagues. We were a small, dedicated team, a chosen family bound by a shared love for preserving stories. The bulk of my energy, however, was dedicated to the project that was my true tribute to him: the Arthur Pembroke Foundation for the Arts. I had spent months working with a team of lawyers and financial advisors to structure it perfectly. Its mission was simple and direct: to provide substantial, multi-year grants to gifted young artists from underprivileged backgrounds. We didn't just give them money for tuition, we gave them funding for materials, studio space, and a living stipend, freeing them from the crushing burden of having to choose between their art and their survival. The foundation's launch event was held in a beautiful, light-filled gallery downtown. It was the first time I had stepped into a public role, speaking not as a conservator, but as a founder. As I stood at the podium, looking out at a crowd of artists, patrons, and journalists, I spoke about Arthur, not about his wealth, but about his belief that beauty and creativity were essential, not frivolous. I announced the first class of 5 Pembroke scholars. One of them, a young woman named Maya, was a sculptor who worked with scrap metal, turning discarded industrial waste into breathtakingly beautiful, intricate figures. She had grown up in foster care and had been working 2 minimum-wage jobs to support her art. As she came to the stage to accept the grant, tears streamed down her face. "This isn't just money," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This is permission. Permission to believe that my voice matters." In that moment, watching her, I felt Arthur's presence so strongly it was almost a physical warmth. This was his true legacy, not the cold, hard figures in a bank account, but the tangible, life-altering impact it could create. Meanwhile, the world my parents and brother had so carefully constructed had crumbled into dust. Their justice wasn't a single, dramatic event, but a slow, grinding erosion of the very things they held most dear: money and status. My Aunt Carol, who had cautiously re-established contact with me, gave me occasional, unsolicited updates. The Courtroom video had become a piece of local lore in their affluent community. They were the punchline to a very expensive joke. My father, once a respected figure who sat on the boards of the city's most prestigious charities, was politely asked to resign from all of them. The shame was too public, the evidence of his character too damning. My mother, who had built her entire identity around her social standing, found herself in a silent, gilded exile. The invitations to luncheons and galas stopped arriving. Her phone calls to her dearest friends went unanswered. The financial ruin was just as swift. The public scandal caused the investors in Leo's latest tech venture to pull their funding overnight. His company, built on buzz and my parents' money, imploded. The fallout was catastrophic. To cover Leo's debts and their own substantial legal fees, they were forced to sell their house, the grand, six-bedroom symbol of their success. I remember my aunt telling me about the estate sale, how strangers picked through their designer furniture and my mother's prized porcelain, haggling over the remnants of their life. They moved into a cramped, generic rental townhouse in a suburb, far from their old circles of influence. But the true justice, the real consequence, was the internal collapse of their family unit. Once united in their greed, they now turned on each other in their failure. My father, his pride wounded, blamed Leo for being a reckless and incompetent businessman. Leo, stripped of his golden boy status, resented our parents for raising him to be an entitled man-child, incapable of handling real-world failure. My mother was caught in the middle, her two men now at odds, her entire life's project, the perfect, successful family, a complete and utter failure. According to my aunt, they began attending family therapy, not out of a genuine desire for healing, but as a desperate, last-ditch effort to stop the constant, corrosive cycle of blame that had consumed their new, smaller life. About 10 months after the hearing, a letter arrived at my studio. It was from my mother. The elegant, confident script I knew was gone, replaced by a shaky, uncertain hand. I almost threw it away, convinced it would be another litany of excuses. But I opened it. It was short, and for the first time in her life, it was honest. "Clara," it read, "there is no excuse for what we did. I have spent every day of the last 10 months trying to understand how I became a person who could do that to her own child. Our greed, our pride, it made us blind. It made us cruel. I look at your father and your brother, and I see 3 broken people who broke the one good thing we had. I have lost my father and my daughter in the same year. I live with that regret every moment. I am not writing to ask for your forgiveness, as I know I have not earned it. I am not writing to ask for anything. I am writing to ask if, one day, if you ever feel able, you would be willing to just talk to me. I need to understand what I have done." End quote. It was the most vulnerable, most authentic thing she had ever said to me. The letter sat on my desk for over a month. I reread it countless times, dissecting every word. I discussed it with my therapist, who helped me see it not as an obligation, but as a choice. My forgiveness wasn't something she was entitled to. It was something I could choose to explore on my own terms, if it served my own healing. I finally wrote back a short, simple note, agreeing to meet for coffee. Sitting across from her in that bright, busy cafe was like meeting a stranger. The meticulously coiffed hair was now simply styled, threaded with more gray than I remembered. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by a simple sweater. The hard, judgmental glint in her eyes had been replaced by a deep, weary sadness. We didn't talk about the lawsuit, the money, or the video. Instead, she asked me about the foundation. She asked about my apprentices. She asked about a difficult restoration project I was working on. And she listened. For the first time in my 32 years, my mother listened to me without interrupting, without judging, without turning the conversation back to herself or Leo. It was awkward and halting, filled with long pauses, but it was real. The old relationship, built on a foundation of lies, was dead. But as we said a polite goodbye, I felt a flicker of hope that perhaps, over many years, a new, more honest connection could be built from the rubble. I hadn't reconnected with my father or Leo. My father's betrayal, his willingness to have me declared incompetent, felt like a line I wasn't ready to uncross. And Leo's one attempt at an apology, a rambling, self-pitying email, had shown me he still didn't truly understand the depth of his cruelty. My boundary was clear. I would engage only with honesty and accountability. My mother was taking the first, tentative steps. The others were not. And for now, that was okay. The final piece of my grandfather's puzzle wasn't just about finding the money, but about understanding that I had the power to decide who was worthy of a place in the new, beautiful life I was building with it. Looking back on that tumultuous year, I've come to understand the profound, multi-layered truth of what my grandfather did. The inheritance he left me wasn't the $18 million hidden in the backs of paintings and tucked inside hollowed-out books. That was just the tool, the raw material. The real inheritance, the one that has fundamentally reshaped my existence, was the journey he sent me on to claim it. It was a brilliantly designed, posthumous crash course in self-reliance, a final, poignant lesson in trusting my own instincts, my own intellect, and my own unique skills. For years, my family had defined my quiet, meticulous nature as a weakness, a sign of my inability to compete in their aggressive, transactional world. But Arthur, in his infinite and eccentric wisdom, knew that my patience, my eye for detail, and my ability to see what lies beneath the surface were not weaknesses at all. They were my superpowers. He didn't just give me wealth. He forced me to unearth my own strength, a treasure far more valuable and enduring than any bearer bond. The money, in and of itself, didn't change who I was. I still live in the same cozy, book-filled apartment. I still find my greatest joy in the quiet, focused work of my studio. I haven't bought a yacht, or a mansion, or a fleet of expensive cars, but the money acted as a powerful, unforgiving catalyst. It was a harsh, clarifying light that, when shone upon the polished surface of my family, revealed the deep, structural rot that had been festering beneath for decades. It illuminated the true character of everyone around me, and in its glare, I was forced to see truths I had spent a lifetime trying to ignore. The most painful and liberating lesson I learned is that family is not an unconditional guarantee of love, loyalty, or even basic human decency. The word itself is just a label. It's the actions, the choices, and the consistent patterns of behavior that give it meaning. Sometimes, the people who share your blood are the ones who are most willing to drain it from you, who see your kindness not as a gift but as a resource to be exploited. For years, I had operated under the delusion that if I were just quiet enough, helpful enough, and undemanding enough, my parents and brother would eventually see my worth. The courtroom battle shattered that illusion. It taught me that you cannot earn respect from people who are fundamentally incapable of giving it. True family, I have learned, are the people who value you for who you are, not for what you can provide. They are the ones who stand with you when you have nothing, not just the ones who show up when you have everything. My grandfather knew that. Mr. Harrison knew that. The friends who checked in on me, who listened to my pain without judgment, they knew that. And now I know it in my bones. This realization led to the second great lesson, that boundaries are not acts of aggression, but the highest form of self-respect. They are not walls you build to punish others, but fences you erect to protect your own peace, your own sanity, and your own integrity. Saying no to toxic behavior, walking away from a relationship that is built on disrespect, is not about inflicting pain. It's about ending your own. For my entire life, I had made myself small to keep the peace in my family. I had swallowed my hurt, minimized my achievements, and accepted a supporting role in a narrative that was never meant to include my happiness. But the peace I thought I was keeping was a fragile, false peace. It was the quiet of a battlefield before the inevitable slaughter. True peace, I have discovered, doesn't come from placating those who would diminish you. It comes from having the unwavering courage to stand in your own truth, to claim your own space, even if, for a time, you have to stand there alone. My relationship with my mother is a testament to this new understanding. It is a work in progress, a fragile bridge being built over a chasm of past hurts. We meet for coffee once a month. The conversations are often stilted, filled with the ghosts of things left unsaid. But there is a consistent effort, a tentative attempt at a new kind of connection that wasn't possible before. She is in therapy, and for the first time, she is trying to understand her own motivations, her own role in the family's dysfunction. I have not reconnected with my father or my brother. My father's betrayal, his clinical willingness to have me declared incompetent to serve his own ends, felt like a moral line I am not yet ready to uncross. Forgiveness, I've learned, cannot be rushed. It can only be arrived at honestly, and I am not there yet. Leo sent one awkward, rambling email of apology, but it was steeped in self-pity, focusing more on what he had lost than on what he had done. It showed me he still didn't truly understand the depth of his cruelty. My boundary is now clear and non-negotiable. I will engage only with genuine accountability. My mother is taking the first painful steps toward it. The others, as of now, are not. And for the first time in my life, I am okay with that. I am no longer waiting for them to become the family I always wanted. I am too busy building a beautiful, fulfilling life surrounded by the family I have chosen. This chosen family is a vibrant tapestry woven from threads of mutual respect and shared passion. It includes my brilliant apprentices, Maria and Ben, who fill my studio with new energy and ideas. It includes the incredible, resilient Pembroke scholars, whose courage and creativity inspire me every single day. It includes Mr. Harrison, who has become a true mentor and friend. It includes my Aunt Carol, who had the courage to break with the family consensus and offer me quiet support. These are the people who make up my world now. Together, we are building a community, a legacy of support and creativity that honors the very best parts of my grandfather's spirit. The final, and perhaps most important, lesson Arthur taught me is that a legacy isn't about the wealth you leave behind. It is about the good you create, the stories you preserve, and the positive impact you have on the lives you touch. It's about empowering others to see the beauty and potential in themselves, just as he did for me. My story is a dramatic one, filled with hidden clues and courtroom showdowns, but at its heart, it's about a universal struggle. It's about finding your voice in a family that wants you to be silent. It's about claiming your worth when others have spent a lifetime trying to define it for you. It's about the terrifying, exhilarating act of walking away from a familiar pain to embrace an unknown future. Have you ever had to fight for what you believed in, even against the very people who were supposed to be on your side? Have you ever had to set a difficult boundary to protect your own well-being? How did you find the strength to stand your ground and choose yourself? I would love to hear your story, your own tale of strength and justice, in the comments below. Your experiences matter, and they can be a lifeline for someone else who might be feeling alone in their own struggle right now. If this story resonated with you, if it touched a part of you that understands the fight for self-respect, please hit that like button, subscribe for more stories of strength and resilience, and share this with someone who might need a reminder of their own worth and power. Remember, sometimes the greatest treasures we can find aren't hidden in paintings or secret vaults. They are hidden within ourselves, buried beneath years of doubt and fear, just waiting for the right moment and the right reason to finally, gloriously be discovered. Thank you for listening.